Hi, welcome back. It's month 7 of My Magical Garden. This month we're going to be making our half square triangle borders for our beautiful applique quilt. The half square triangle borders are made with one of 4 different methods of half square triangles. I'm going to show you today all 4 half square triangle methods so you can pick the one that's right for you. The first method that we're going to use today is using the Thangles papers to make our half square triangles. This paper is for a 2-inch finished half square triangle, and it makes 450 half square triangle units from 2.5-inch strips of fabric. The T-sheets are very similar to Thangles, except instead of having the individual strips using 2.5-inch strips of fabric like the Thangles, we have an entire sheet printed with the Thangles, so that if you have odd size pieces of fabric, you can make your fabric from this size all the way up to any number that's on the sheet. So if you're making half square triangles that are all identical, you would want to use the whole sheet of Thangles or the T-sheets without cutting them apart into the Thangle papers. So you can see the Thangle paper is just one set of 3 of these pieces right here. So the T-sheets make Thangles, or you have the Thangle papers that are already pre-cut for you, so you can make half square triangles from 2.5-inch strips. The Thangles come with a nice instruction sheet that give you some tips to use when you're laying out your Thangles. So when we're making our 2-inch Thangles, we've put 2 2.5-inch strips together, dark on the back, light on the front, and then our 2.5-inch wide Thangle paper. Now we're putting in some pins at the same angle as our stitching lines so that we're not covering up the stitching lines with our pins. That way you won't run into them as you're sewing. Just 2 or 3 pins per strip is going to work out great. Now we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam, but you don't have to worry about that 1/4 inch seam because you actually have a stitching line to follow. So just center your needle in your presser foot and follow that stitching line, and we're going to chain piece these together. So I'm going to slide another Thangle with my 2.5-inch strips right next to the first one, and I can do these 5 or 6 at a time so that there's continuous stitching, and it's a very easy method of stitching. Again, I would do several at a time. Right now I'm just doing 2 so that you don't have to watch me do all this stitching. We're just going to do a couple here for you so you can see how I've just lined up the stitching lines, so I can go right off the end of one and on to another one and stitch in continuous lines. Now, if you're doing a whole lot of Thangles that are exactly the same colors, then you can use the Thangles paper, which are called T-sheets. And the T-sheets are lined up so that you're sewing a zigzag pattern. So it's, again, all continuous line stitching. Very, very easy to do. Because your stitching line is printed on the paper, you're going to increase your accuracy with the Thangles. After you're done with all of your stitching, you want to go ahead and pull out your pins, and then we're going to bring it over to the cutting mat and show you how to cut them apart to get accurately sized half square triangle units. So I've gone to the sewing machine and I've sewn on the dashed line. Now this is critical. This sewing line has to be exact in order for your half square triangle units to come out accurate on the Thangles. So if you're not confident with your stitching lines, this is not the method for you. Because we're cutting out the half square triangle units while they're still folded, our pressing and our stitching are critical in this method. If you know that you can stitch accurately, and you also know that you can be very careful with pressing and not stretch your fabrics, then this is a wonderful and fast method. Let me show you a few little tricks with using Thangles. The first thing is that you can start with 2.5-inch strips. So any size scrap will work. You can do 2 at a time, 4 at a time, or 6 at a time to use up all your small scraps of fabric. That's one of the reasons why I like the Thangle method best, particularly where we're using all the scraps of our background fabrics, and we've cut our background fabrics either into 21.5-inch squares or 11-inch squares in the first step of our quilt. We have a lot of odd pieces left over. So the Thangles use up all those odd pieces, and you don't necessarily need the 6-inch squares like we do for the 8 at a time method. Now we're going to trim them apart between the stitching lines. So that's more easily done with our scissors, or you could use your rotary cutter for that step. Now that we have our Thangle units all sewn, we have to very accurately cut these Thangle units apart with the fabric still layered 2 layers at a time. Now on the Thangle units, there is a solid line, a little gap, and then another solid line. So you're looking for the gap between the 2 solid lines when you're cutting, using your ruler and your rotary cutter to cut those apart. So we're cutting on all of the solid lines, not on the dash lines. When you use the Thangles, you do end up with dog ears. So I want to show you that in the pressing stage. Let me cut a few more of these Thangles apart so I can show you the pressing stage for the Thangles. So I'm aiming at the gap between the 2 solid lines, and now I'm going to cut on that diagonal line between my 2 stitching lines. So very quickly we have 6 half square triangles made from one group of Thangles. Now we're going to bring these over to our pressing station, and you can see one of the advantages to using the Thangles is that the paper stabilizes the edge of the triangle that is our bias edge. When the Thangles are made so that you're sewing along the bias edges. So when your half square triangles are completely finished, all of the edges are on the straight. Now I forgot to mention that initially, when we made our 8 at a time using the 2 6-inch squares, for that method, all of your seam allowances are on the diagonal, so all the edges of your half square triangles are on the straight grain of fabric, and that is very important. The methods that I'm showing you are my favorite methods, and I'm not going to show you any method that creates a bias edge right here. I won't even mention those methods, but if you find a method on YouTube or the internet, make sure that you don't end up with bias edges on your half square triangles. That's just looking for problems down the road when you're piecing. And this method, even though you're stitching those bias edges together, you're stitching them as a unit, and there's no exposed bias edges when you're stitching. You're only cutting between those lines later. So as you're stitching, nothing is stretching. As you're pressing, nothing is stretching because you have the paper on the thangles. That paper is made so that your markings will not come off on your iron like it would if you made these thangles or you made a half square triangle method where you print your own papers on your printer. Your printer, the ink is going to come off on your iron. So you don't want to be printing these yourself. So that's a method that from the internet that I don't care for, is when you print your own papers. Now the thangles are all, the half square triangles are all pressed. So now it's time to remove the paper. There's a couple of methods to do this. You can do it in one quick pull like this and then remove the piece that's in the seam allowance, or you can hold the seam allowance with your fingernail and peel away from the seam allowance. I like to just give it a yank, pull it really quickly and easily. It's like pulling off a Band-Aid, and your pieces come out really, the paper comes out really easily. This paper is made to tear extremely easily, and I would sit on a long car ride and pull out all my papers from my thangles. It's not the same as paper piecing because you're not going over these seam allowances again. You're pulling out the papers first, so they're very, very easy to remove, just like this, and it really takes no time at all. The only drawback that I see with the thangles is if you're not accurate with your cutting, your pieces can be slightly off, and you have this dog ear. So you may want to go back and trim your dog ears after. That's up to you if you want to just deal with them or you want to trim them all. So the advantage to thangles is that you can use all those odd sizes of fabric leftovers to make your half square triangles. The disadvantage, one of the disadvantages is you have to tear out the paper, and your cutting and your stitching has to be very accurate. Your pressing, not so much, because the paper keeps your pressing from stretching out the shape of your half square triangle. When I'm sewing half square triangles 8 at a time, I start with 2 6-inch squares. I've drawn my diagonal line from corner to corner on the light square. If you want to use your iron erasable chalk, just do that on the dark square. Then you're going to sew these triangles a scant 1/4 inch on each side of the center line. So I like to stack them up like this, so I can easily grab 2 at a time and put them right through my sewing machine and chain stitch these. So let's get started with my first one. And I've got a really nice 1/4 inch foot here. It's got a bar that runs right along the center line, and I've adjusted my stitch width so I'm getting a scant 1/4 inch. Now it is important to use a scant 1/4 inch instead of a true 1/4 inch. These 6-inch squares are sized so that there's minimal fabric waste. There's really not a lot of room for error. So if you are sewing too big of a seam, you think it's a 1/4 inch, but it's a few hairs over, you're not going to have any fabric to trim away. So I'd rather you go a few hairs less than a 1/4 inch. The size of the seam allowance truly doesn't matter because we're trimming after. So when I've chain pieced like this, I can just turn my work around and go ahead and do that second row. If you prefer, you can snip those together in between, but I just go in one continuous chain Now doing all 40 like this might not be a good idea. They might get tangled, but if they do, just go ahead and trim the threads in between. So chaining them together goes really quickly. Again, I'm not being too careful on my 1/4 of an inch because I don't have to be. Trimming up later will give us accurately sized half square triangles. But you know that precision all along the way makes for a better end product. So be as careful as you can. So now I've sewn these in one direction. I'm going to trim them apart. And then I'm going to turn them 90 degrees and start sewing in the opposite direction. So you're going to have 4 lines of stitching on each square. And once you do, we'll be ready to cut these between the lines in order to make our half square triangle blocks. Now that we have chain stitched those together, we can press these seams as they are just to set the seams. That locks the threads in, pushes it into the fibers so that it lays more flat when you press the seams to the dark side. So once you have cut apart on the 3-inch marking in both directions and then diagonally in both directions from point to point on your squares, you end up with 8 individual half square triangle units. Now the way that we press and trim these is what I'm going to show you now. We have lots of different methods of pressing and trimming, and they all have their advantages and their disadvantages. The first tool that we're going to use to trim our half square triangle units is the Clearly Perfect Slotted Trimmers by Carrie Carr of New Leaf Studios. This Clearly Perfect Slotted Trimmer is called a slotted trimmer because there are slots right here so that you can trim off the dog ears from your half square triangle units. Now let me show you how this tool works. The first thing is you have to find the right tool to use. And this is trimmer A. It's all your 1/2 inch half square triangle units. So we have 1.5 on this line and 2.5 on this line. What we're doing is we're placing the dotted seam line right over our stitching line and wiggle that around to make sure it matches up with your seam line precisely. Now we're going to trim 2 sides of that half square triangle unit, but we're also going to use the slots in the tool to trim away our dog ears from the corners of the half square triangle units. So now we have a perfectly trimmed half square triangle unit, but we do need to press those open with the seam going towards the dark color. So I like to finger press this very, very gently and then bring it over to my ironing board to press this open. Now, one of the advantages of the Clearly Perfect Slotted Trimmer is you're only trimming 2 sides of your triangle, so it's a little faster than the methods that I'm going to show you next. However, because you are pressing after you trim, if you stretch this seam as you're pressing, you're not going to get an accurately sized and shaped half square triangle unit. After trimming with the New Leaf Studios tool, I do like to open that seam up to the dark side, so press the seam to the dark side, and you're going to be very gentle with your pressing so that you don't stretch your half square triangle units at all. That's a beautiful 2.5 inch unit right there. The next tool that I want to show you is the Tucker trimmer. The Tucker trimmer comes in one template for all different size triangles. If you look over here where there's a full circle, you're going to have your full sizes 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. If you look at this end, which has a half circle marking, those are all your half-inch half square triangle units, 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, etc. So you have to know what size you're going to be making. We're going to use the 2.5-inch marking down on this end. I did use Grace True Grips on the back of my tool to prevent this tool from sliding as I trim. But with this tool, we need to press our seam allowances to the dark side first. So let's press some of these to the dark side, and then I'll show you how to use this tool to trim. To use the Tucker trimmer, or the block lock ruler, or your standard ruler, we're going to press our seam allowances to the dark side first before we trim. So we can work with our whole stack of 8 half square triangle units. If I put them dark side up, I can pick these up one at a time with the dark side, and that's going to help me lay that seam allowance right over towards the dark side. Now, I don't have to be as careful pressing as I did with the New Leaf Studios ruler, because if I stretch a little bit as I press, it's not such a problem because I'm trimming later. So my half square triangle units will end up the exact correct size. But I still try my best not to stretch because I want that seam allowance to lay in a perfect straight line. If I do stretch, I might get a little bit of a curved line. So pressing still matters. You're going to follow all your best pressing practices. Now I'm just going to let these cool for a minute, get rid of my ironing board, and we are going to start to trim those half square triangle units. Here I have a stack of 8 half square triangle units, and it's going to be very easy to trim those with one of 3 different tools. So first I'm going to show you the Tucker trimmer, and we're using the 2.5-inch line right here. There is a diagonal line on the Tucker trimmer. You're going to place that diagonal line on the seam line that we've just sewn. We're going to slide that tool up as close as we can to the corner of our square, and we're going to trim 2 sides of the square. When we do that, we're not only trimming the edges of the square, but we're also trimming the dog ear. Now I've turned that block 180 degrees, so now the trimmed side is falling right on the dashed line that marks a 2.5-inch square. So we know the finished size of our square is going to be exactly 2.5 inches. Now I'm finding my squares a little bit small, so I'm going to adjust my seam allowance and do a scant 1/4 inch when I'm sewing to make sure that I have enough to trim off all 4 sides. This one's a little bit better. We're going to use the diagonal line once again, trim off 2 sides, then we're going to spin that square 180 degrees, use the diagonal line again, and our dash line that outlines the 2.5-inch square. Place that on your square and trim off both sides, which includes trimming off your dog ears. So these units are absolutely the perfect size. They are going to go together beautifully into your borders. Now this Tucker trimmer is a wonderful tool Not only does it make half square triangle units, but you can use the same tool for quarter square triangle units and combination units. So this is a very good value when you invest in the Tucker trimmer because it does more than half square triangles. The Block Lock tool is a wonderful tool for half square triangles, and they come in all different sizes. I happen to have Block Lock rulers for half square triangles in a 2-inch size, 4, and a 6-inch size. This is actually 6.5. This one is 4.5. So depending on which size Block Lock ruler you have, your half square triangles can go all the way up to 6.5 inches. I really love to use the 4-inch tool to make most of the sizes that I commonly use in my quilts. This size that we're making right now is 2.5 inches. The 2.5 inch marking right here on the tool can easily be used with this larger tool or the 6-inch tool. But the 4-inch is a little less cumbersome, and that's my favorite one to use. Now with the Block Lock ruler, there's a groove in the back of the ruler that holds onto your seam allowance. So here we go, we're going to place it on our fabric, but this one I placed incorrectly. You can see that my fabric here is twice as big and there's just a little bit here. So I know that was not the right way to place the Block Lock ruler on the square. So what is the rule of thumb here? If you're pressing to the dark side says patent pending here on the tool. The Block Lock logo is going to go on the light side of your fabric. So if you can remember that, that's just great. But if not, you're going to be able to see that it was incorrect before, and now it's correct because as this locks onto our seam allowance, we can push the tool all the way up to the furthest point. So we're going to trim off, once again, 2 sides of our square. So just like the Deb Tucker ruler, we're cutting off 2 sides of the square. But then we're going to spin the entire tool and the block at the same time. And now we're going to slide that tool down. Do you see how beautifully it locks into that seam? So I'm not having any trouble sliding it down so the seam line stays right on the diagonal line on the ruler. Now I find the 2.5 inch line on the ruler. Make sure the outside edge that I've already trimmed is on that diagonal line, and I'm going to trim the other 2 sides of my square. So using the Block Lock ruler is just as accurate as the Deb Tucker ruler, but it's actually, I think, a little bit easier because you're not making a judgment call on lining up your square on that diagonal line. The groove in the back of the tool actually holds that diagonal line perfectly, so it's much easier to square up your blocks. Now, the downside of the Block Lock ruler is the price. This is one of your more expensive options. However, if you do a lot of half square triangle units, you might find it's worth the cost. Now you can see that I've put my logo over my dark color. That is incorrect. Remember, the logo has to be over the light color for this diagonal line to line up with the seam allowance properly, so you can slide all the way up to the corner of your block. It takes a little getting used to, but once you get used to this Block Lock ruler, I do feel it's one of the easier methods with less chance of error. Now on the Block Lock ruler, I did not add any Grace True Grips. You don't want grips on the back of your ruler. That's going to prevent you from sliding that ruler and twisting the ruler around. The groove itself locks your block in place so that we don't need the Grace True grips on the bottom of the ruler. We can use one other method to trim our half square triangles. And for this method, you don't need to buy a new tool. You probably have this tool already in your tool kit. This is my least favorite method of trimming my half square triangles because depending on your ruler, you have to be really careful of the measurements. So if I were to use this handy square, it's a Marty Mitchell product, I have to be very careful of my measurements. I have a 1/4 of an inch right here before my first dark line starts. So if I'm going for 2.5 inches, I have to actually go over by a 1/4 of an inch to find the 2.5 inch line. That can be really confusing. So you have to really know your ruler if you're going to use this ruler for cutting half square triangles. It's very doable. There is a diagonal line on the tool. So if you place the diagonal line right over your stitching line and trim off the least possible amount from your half square triangle, then turn that half square triangle around and find that diagonal line once again. Now this is where I would use either glow line tape or these arrows that we can use on our tools to mark a certain measurement. Because the measurements are difficult to follow on this ruler, I would definitely mark a line right around that 2.5 inch, the perfect size for the 2.5 inch square, so that I don't miscut when I'm making my half square triangle units. You can see that this is also a good way to cut your units without having to buy anything new. I just caution you that if you're doing if you're making a large number of half square triangle units, the tools that are intended for half square triangle units actually will give you a better result. However, you don't always need a new tool, and if you don't plan to make a lot of half square triangle units, you can just find a method that works for you with the tools that you already have in-house. So very quickly we've been able to square up all 8 of these half square triangle units using all of our different methods. So all of the methods that I've shown you, I would use in a quilt. I find them all very easy. They all have certain advantages and disadvantages. You have to weigh those out yourself. You know what your tolerance level is for accuracy. If you're looking for the most accurate method, my recommendation would be either Block Lock or Deb Tucker. If you're looking for speed, I recommend the Thangles or the New Leaf Studios ruler. But overall, it's a personal decision that you have to make. So my first quilt I did with Thangles. The second quilt I made with the Block Lock ruler. And the third quilt we'll use the Deb Tucker ruler. And I think all of those methods are going to be beautiful to use. And I don't really have a recommendation for you. The all-time best way to do half square triangles, that's really a personal decision. So I'll show you in the next segment how we're going to sew our accurately pieced half square triangles together into our borders, and then we're ready to finish up the applique on our borders, and we're getting very close to the end where we're going to be assembling all these pieces into a beautiful quilt. The next step in making our half square triangle borders is to start our borders from the center out. We have two different borders that we're starting. We're going to take our big pile of half square triangles and we're going to put the two dark edges together for one set of borders, and we're going to put the light edges together for a second set of borders. We're going to have 4 that start this way and 4 that start this way. So you can see we're just going to put right sides together, light sides together, and sew our scant 1/4 inch seam. Then we're going to do the same thing for the darks. Put the dark edges together, make sure they line up perfectly, and sew those with a scant 1/4 inch seam. And then I'm going to open that middle seam. I open the middle seam with my iron, and now I'm going to continue adding my half square triangles in the same manner. So this wouldn't be right. I need all of my dark triangles to be along the bottom edge and coming up to a point here. This one on this side is going to mimic this one. So in each direction, the triangles are dark across the bottom, but they come in at opposite angles. So when I'm going to add to this side, I'm going to fold across, stitch, and then back out again. Then I'm going to add to this side, folding across, stitching, and out again. So you can see how this as my starting point, I have to add the triangles in different ways. For this one, you have a light this way and this way, with your dark diagonal this way. We're going to keep the same pattern, light, light with a dark diagonal. Here we have light, light with a dark diagonal. So sometimes I have to spin those half square triangles around until it looks correct to me. The dark diagonals are really what you're looking for, and they have to work from the center out, so they're in a mirror image pattern. So I'm going to have 4 borders that start this way, 4 borders that start this way, and then I'm going to look in my instructions for the correct number of half square triangles to add. When you're looking at your instructions, it says that border 1, the inside border on the top, is going to have 30 half square triangles. So keep adding them one at a time on each end of your center until you have 30 triangles long. Now your side borders for the inner border have 40 triangles. So you stop at 30 for this one and continue on and add 40 for the next one. So I've started that with my batik version, and this is the Island Batik fabric, and I've started both sets of borders. So here is one set of 4 borders. You can see how the dark diagonals continue in the same pattern, and I'm going to keep adding until I get the correct length. 2 of my borders will be one length, 2 of my borders will be a different length, because I have my top border and my top and bottom border, and then my 2 side borders in each case. But the center is different if we're talking about the innermost border or the outermost border on our quilt. So pay attention to that center point, and that we have the lights together in one group and the darks together in another group. In the instructions, I talk about that first that starting triangle, and one hint that I give is that this part right here looks like an M to me. Do you see the dark colored M? So that's one way to think about this center. When you look at this center, it has a light colored M. We could also look at the V, but in the instructions I wrote we have a light colored M and a dark colored M. So that's one way to think about this. The other way to do it is just to look at the picture itself of the quilt, starting in the center of each border. Determine if it has a light color M or a dark color M, and then keep adding your triangles on each side to the correct number of triangles. This border is so simple to do, but using some of these little tricks will keep you from getting confused and will make this go a little more quickly and easily. And chain piecing is definitely the way to go. As I'm working on my light colored M, I'm adding 4 half square triangles at a time, and they're all in the same orientation. So using the dark diagonal, then put this right sides together. We're going to match up that dark diagonal, put them right sides together, add another one, dark diagonal, spin it around until it looks the same as the one directly next to it, and stitch together. And my last one, dark diagonal this way, fold it over, right sides together, and stitch this all together in one continuous seam. Then you can turn around all 4 at once because they're all linked together, and do the same thing on the other side. That way you are building up your borders equally in both directions, and I find it so much easier to do when you are chain piecing these together. Now a little bit about your colors. I used one color for the dark side of my half square triangle units. All of my greens are the same. I used all the different colors of backgrounds. There are 6 or 8 different backgrounds in this particular quilt. I used all of them, so I have a scrappy looking background, but the unifying color is the green. You can play around with that in your quilt. The instructions and the yardage was for the greens to be all the same color or the dark points to be all the same color. Now when I use the Fangles method and I'm able to use up all of my scraps, I had plenty of fabric to do the half square triangles, and I still had enough fabric for the green to be my binding. However, when I needed to cut 6-inch squares for the 8 at a time method, I ran out of the green fabric and I no longer had enough of this green fabric to be my binding. So if this happens to you, you're going to let me know, and we're going to buy another 2/3 of a yard for your binding. And if you bought the kit from me, I will provide that fabric for you. So let me know if you run out of fabric for your binding, and we're going to take care of you because my measurements were off. My first quilt, I used the Fangles. I was able to use up all the scraps, but in this quilt, I used the squares, and I ran out of the fabric that I had intended to use for binding. I had to make some 6-inch squares from that fabric, and I no longer have enough fabric for my binding. So just let me know if that happens to you, and I'll make it right. We'll make sure we get enough fabric to you to finish up your binding, and we'll be on our way and finishing this beautiful quilt together in the next 2 months.